Will the governors please come in? We have a very busy afternoon, but an exciting one. We have some outstanding speakers that are going to be addressing the governors this afternoon. And I would like to have as many governors come in as soon as possible so we can get started. Governor Graves, could you come in? Governor Whitman, Governor Zell Miller, would you please? Governor Voinovich, could you please come in? Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor this afternoon to have the privilege of introducing an outstanding leader in America, somebody I think that all Americans are deeply indebted to him for his leadership and his dedication. We're going to be able to discuss this afternoon as governors a crucial national issue. What is driving the United States economy, and how is the structure of the economy changing? And I believe very strongly, personally, that one of the primary reasons our economy is as strong as it is today is that Federal Reserve Board and its esteemed chairman, Alan Greenspan, has supported sustained growth with low-price inflation. This means more Americans can afford college loans, and more young families can buy their first home and have their first new car. Chairman Greenspan knows what he talks about. He is the former chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, chairman of the National Commission on Social Security Reforms, and board member of several Fortune 500 companies. Mr. Chairman, we are deeply in your debt for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. We appreciate your leadership and we thank you for coming. Mr. Greenspan.
Thank you very much, Governor. I'm really quite impressed to look around the room and see that everyone apparently has got the same first name. I hope I can live up to Governor Thompson's view of what I'm supposed to do, but I'll try, and I must say that we are dealing in a period which is probably one of the most fundamentally changing periods in American economic history. The United States is currently confronting a set of forces pulling us in divergent directions. The rapid acceleration of computer and telecommunication technologies can reasonably be expected to appreciably raise our productivity and standards of living in the 21st century, certainly, and quite possibly in some of the remaining years of this century. In the short run, however, the fallout from rapidly changing technology has created a marked degree of uncertainty and insecurity among a significant segment of our workforce. It should not be surprising to find that when the stock of plant and equipment with which most Americans have to interact in their day-by-day job routines is turning over rapidly as it is today, human skills are subject to obsolescence at a rate perhaps unprecedented in American history. Almost 6 years ago, I stressed to this association the dramatic trends towards an ever-increasing conceptualization of our gross domestic product, the substitution, in effect, of ideas for physical matter in the creation of economic value. This afternoon, I should like to update and extend the implications of these extraordinary forces which are driving the American economy and indeed most of the major industrial economies in the world as well. The roots of increasing conceptualization of output lie deep in human history, but the pace of such substitution probably picked up in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution when science and machines created new leverage for human energy. Nonetheless, even as recently as the middle of this century, the symbols of American economic strength were our output of such products as steel, motor vehicles, and heavy machinery, items for which sizable proportions of production costs reflected the value of raw materials and the sheer manual labor required to manipulate them. Since then, trends towards conceptualization have focused today's views of economic leadership increasingly on downsized, smaller, less palpable evidence of output, requiring more technologically sophisticated labor input. Our radios used to be activated by large vacuum tubes. Today we have elegantly designed pocket-sized transistors to perform the same function, but with the higher quality of sound and greater reliability that consumers now expect. Thin fiber optic cable has replaced huge tonnages of copper wire. Advances in architecture and engineering, as well as the development of lighter but stronger materials, now give us the same working space, but in buildings with significantly less concrete, glass, and steel tonnage that was required in an earlier era. If we actually had the data and effectively weighed our gross national product in tons, we would find that it was rising at an imperceptibly mild rise, whereas the total value added has been rising at a fairly pronounced pace, the difference basically being the substitution of ideas. The process of conceptualization and output seems to have accelerated in recent decades with the advent of the semiconductor, the microprocessor, the computer, and the satellite. These technologies have become especially significant since my visit with you in 1989. Under the circumstances, it has puzzled many of us that the growth of output as customarily measured has not evidenced a corresponding pickup. Of course, output may not be measured correctly. Indeed, the financial markets are suggesting that we increasingly expense items which should be capitalized and hence underestimate the growth of our GDP and productivity. But it is also possible that some of the frenetic pace of change is wheel spinning, changing production inputs without increasing output, rather than real advances in productivity. A number of commentators, particularly Professor David of Stanford University, have suggested that much of the wheel spinning, if that's what it is, reflects the extended time it typically has taken to translate a major new technology into increased productivity and higher standards of living. It may be that the big increases in productivity growing out of the introduction of computers and communications equipment still lie ahead. Past innovations such as the advent of electricity or the invention of the gasoline-powered motor vehicles required considerable infrastructure before their full potential could be realized. Electricity, when it substituted for steam power late last century, was applied to production processes suited to steam. Gravity was used to move goods vertically in the steam environment, and that could not initially change with the advent of electric power. It was only when horizontal factories, newly designed for optimal use of electric power, began to dominate our industrial system many years after electricity's initial introduction that productivity, as we usually measure it, clearly accelerated. Similarly, it was only when modern highways and gasoline service stations became extensive that the lower cost of motor vehicle transportation became evident. It is possible that the computer telecommunications revolution is just too new to as yet fundamentally improve standards of living overall. Moreover, to be fully effective, innovations also require a considerable amount of human investment on the part of workers who have to deal with these devices on a day-to-day basis. On this score, I sense that we still may not have progressed very far relative to potential. Compared to the facility with which the average citizen handles another complex device, the automobile, most workers and consumers still appear to possess only rudimentary skills when it comes to making computers do what is wanted of them. Mass acceptance and full exploitation of computer technologies, the analog of what was accomplished in making cars that were affordable, standardized, and easily operated, probably still lie ahead. In the meantime, we have a situation in which there are some serious mismatches between the skills of workers and technologies that have changed considerably and still are advancing rapidly. And these mismatches are affecting pay differentials between the skilled and the unskilled. As conceptualization of output has moved apace, the relative economic value of intellectual skill has clearly increased. During the past 15 years, for example, the earnings of college graduates have increased relative to those who are high school graduates, and in turn, high school graduates have continued to open up their advantage over those who are high school dropouts. In fact, a significant minority of our labor force has experienced real wage decreases, and this development surely is one factor in the unease that is all too prevalent, as well as in the apparent stretching of the distribution of incomes in recent years. Exaggerating this income dispersing trend is the growing evidence of what is being called a winner-take-all society, in which the best in any activity tends to take an increasingly larger share of a market. The best actors, the best basketball players, the best business innovators earn far more than average. The reason is that the major advances in telecommunications technologies have allowed any skill a far wider market than a generation ago. New visual communications allows talent to offer their services throughout the world. Who wants second best when the best is available at nearly the same price? Who buys the records of the fourth or fifth best tenors in the world singing an aria from Don Giovanni? The few top performers take most of the market. A century ago, such performers could not readily compete outside their localized areas. Fortunately, the rapidly changing technologies have engendered an increased degree of competitive intensity, which may very well cap and perhaps reverse the trend toward winner-take-all and other forces increasing income dispersion. Once proud high-tech firms are being upended by new technologies developed by upstarts. But even the latter are lately looking over their shoulders at other upstarts with still newer technologies. The outsized rewards to high skills induce others to emulate them, and hence staying at the top has become ever more precarious. More generally, entrenched economic advantage is being increasingly challenged by a global competition which shows no signs of abating. In addition, we must be alert in coming years to the need to improve the skills and earning power of those who appear to be falling behind. In the long run, better child rearing and better schools are essential. But in the shorter run, on-the-job training is a critical necessity to overcome the educational deficiencies of all too many of our young people, and to renew the skills of workers who have fallen behind the rapidly rising curve of technological change. It has become quite apparent that many firms have concluded that it makes more sense to invest in such training than to bid up wage scales in a zero-sum competition for the existing limited pool of well-qualified workers. As a bottom line, though, workers in many kinds of pursuits probably had better look forward to a lot of hard work acquiring and maintaining the skills needed to cope with a rapidly evolving economy. The notion that early education could be crafted to support the needs of one's life work is rapidly changing. Education is increasingly becoming a lifetime activity. Over time, as workers acquire new skills and as computer applications continue to become ever more user-friendly, the present income mismatches should diminish. To be sure, the most visible force of recent change, the continuous downsizing of microprocessors and hence computer and telecommunications equipment, may increasingly encounter physical limits. But almost as surely, new technologies not now visible will emerge. We can anticipate change to be pervasive, and if competitive forces are allowed free rein and our fiscal problems resolved, we can expect ever higher living standards for all Americans. Will Americans adjust to a frenetic pace of change and allow it to happen? While we have in the past and almost surely will in the future, it is important that we recognize that adjustment is not automatic. We do have episodes in recent human history where, for example, pressures of change were not easily absorbed and people chose what appeared to be a greater degree of security rather than competitive challenge. Competitive forces, especially those driven by technological change, create uncertainty and dislodgement, but they also bring with them an enhanced quality of living and the increased economic abundance so necessary to confront the problems that exist in societies throughout the world. Thank you very much.
Alan, thank you so very much for being here. Thank you for your wonderful words. And I'm going to lead off by the first question, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more that follow. The National Governors Organization has taken a leadership role and urging Congress to use accurate numbers in the CPI. And I would like to ask you, what will happen if we, first off, should Congress do it? I'll put you on the spot. Second, what will happen if they do? And what is the cost savings on the different percentages?
I think there are two issues here, Governor. One is what should be done with the so-called Consumer's Price Index, and what should be done with indexing various federal retirement and tax programs. These are actually two different issues. The Consumer's Price Index, as indeed it is stated within the materials made available by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is not a measure of the cost of living. It is a measure which endeavors to capture average prices at the retail level. And that differs from the cost of living because it's a fixed market basket, and people have demonstrated time and time again that as prices of certain items rise relative to others, consumers switch to the lower priced goods. And as a consequence, the cost of living tends, for that reason alone, to run significantly under the measured Consumer Price Index. Similarly, there are a number of technical issues which are involved in calculating the CPI. For example, it is almost impossible for any agency to capture new products prior to them being matured enough in the market to be recognizable and have wide particular applications of use. The result of this is that since most new products in their very early stages have falling prices and then start to rise thereafter, if you consistently eliminate the first part of this change, namely the decline, and you never go back and revise the data because we have the CPI locked into so many legal contracts, you bias the index higher. There is very little that the Bureau of Labor Statistics can do to alter a number of these technical problems which are built into the structure of what that index is. And as a consequence of that, it can only correct for what is now generally agreed to be an overestimate of the cost of living partially. I testified before the joint hearing of both budget committees up on the Hill about a year ago, and I suggested that there is very potentially significant savings involved if indeed the purpose of the Congress to adjust both tax and retirement programs for the true cost of living indeed did that, which meant that we would have to subtract some of the gains from the CPI, which by general acceptance, as I indicated, overestimates this. Now, part of that adjustment is going to be made by actual changes in the way the BLS adjusts the CPI, and in so doing, it will effectively remove some of the bias, and that will, of course, be in the published data, and no legislation is required to do that other than to fund the BLS properly for them to make those estimates. What I was actually getting at a year ago, and I will repeat today, and I think this is basically what the issue is that we should be legislating some adjustment which would be beyond this technical adjustment and, in effect, produce a new index whose sole purpose is to index programs of the federal government. It's pretty clear that if we were to do that, the original intent of the Congress in endeavoring to hold everyone harmless from changes in the cost of living would be accomplished. but it would require legislation which would essentially say, for want of a better way of coming at this, that the published Consumers Price Index would be used as a means to create this new index, but it would basically be saying it is the Consumers Price Index minus X. And that X presumably would best be judged by a group of nonpartisan technicians who would endeavor to view what in fact the BLS did with respect to the actual index and make what further other adjustments were required to capture a true cost of living. I think basically doing that would have a very major effect, as everyone who has calculated the numbers has found out, on the issue of costs of expenditures in the budget going forward. And I think it's clearly a very sensitive issue because numbers of people are concerned that it is in fact a cut in either Social Security or in various other retirement programs. I don't think that it is. I think what it tends to do is to remove a bias in a governmental procedure to actually endeavor to capture what the Congress, in my judgment, originally intended.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allen. Yes, Governor Whitman.
Given the volatility that you talked about, the change in the marketplace and the workforce, and what you're suggesting on finding true CPI numbers, what about true unemployment numbers? Are monthly numbers, as they are currently compiled by the Department of Labor, accurate for trends planning? Is there a better way to do it? What do those numbers, what do you feel those numbers reflect as they are reported on a monthly basis as they are now? Or have been, they're going to be changed, I guess.
The basic sample, as I recall, is something like 60,000 households a month. And it's a very sophisticated statistical technique which, despite the very small, presumed very small sample of the general workforce, it has, I think, a fairly good history of being accurate as best we can judge. It's not very good on a month-by-month basis because there's a lot of noise in there, but its trends seem to capture basically what unemployment is if you use the definition which the BLS uses, which is basically individuals employed or actively seeking work. And that, I think, over the years has pretty much been accepted by all technicians and economists as probably the best measure of unemployment. That is not to say that you can't get alternate measures by taking discouraged workers, for example, who are not in those data, adding them back, making adjustments for the fact that part-time workers are included the same and equally weighted as total employees. But having said all of that, I don't think that those data give us a misreading of what's going on in the labor markets. And I think they continue to hone the accuracy of it as they have in the last year, about a year and a half ago. And as a consequence of that, I think that's a pretty good statistic.
Thank you. Governor Levitt and then Governor Graves. That was the question.
Greenspan, I was captivated by your argument on the mismatch between our technologies and the capacity to use it. You enumerated your arguments. I was struck by how apt your comments were toward education, higher education and public education in particular. Higher education, for 2,500 years, people have been going to campuses to get knowledge, and now knowledge comes to them. And I can see a day when the kind of winner-take-all strategy you've talked about, or not strategy, but the effect could occur in campuses where you have access to some of the finest and the best on a worldwide basis. I'd be interested to hear you reflect on that in the context of education and what you see the implications being for higher education as an institution and public education as well.
Well, Governor, I think the most important starting point is to recognize that when you take a look at the average age of the capital stock, the plant and equipment that we have in place in this country, which of course our workforce of necessity interfaces with on a day-by-day basis, as I remarked, that is going down, that average age is going down very considerably and quickly. Another way of looking at that is that the capital stock is turning over very quickly. And what that means is that any set of skills that any group of people have at any particular point in time working with this rapidly changing capital stock are almost surely going to become obsolete or obsolescent perhaps within a relatively short period of time. And were they not to continuously endeavor to hold up skills, upgrade them, and change them, job security, I think, which is under real stress at this particular stage because of this process, would worsen. I mean, one need only consider, for example, the possibility of how a skilled typist who has been working for 20 years honing those skills is all of a sudden confronted with somebody changing the structure of the keyboard. You feel as though the world has changed, and indeed, to a lesser extent, that is what is going on. So what strikes me as the major issue which is coming up with respect to the question of education generally is the necessity of continuous education. I'm sure, as you know, Governor, there are innumerable high-tech corporations particularly who have separate internal universities in which they require that their workforce go to school periodically to continuously hone skills. And I think what we are in the process of seeing at this stage is an increasing interaction between corporate America, or business America generally, and education. Because what we tend to do in public schools or private universities is increasingly teach abstract questions of how to handle various things, which is very useful, but it is terribly important for people who are working on complex technologies not to be given wide abstractions, but to have capabilities of adjusting very explicitly to very specific technological changes so that their value added when associated with this capital stock is at a maximum and their incomes are at a maximum. So what I see the markets tending to do is to increasingly force a larger and probably progressively increasing share of our educational efforts into the business community itself. And I think that because education per se is an ever increasingly important issue, because if what we're turning out is conceptual as distinct from physical, either people using computers and being able to deal with the new technologies, unless they can do that, they have the risk of falling behind. The one thing we do know, very fortunately, from looking at the way technology changes, is that every human being is got capabilities which cannot be replicated by technology, so that there is a fundamental, deep-seated value added in the way a human being functions that can create very significant real incomes when interfaced with this complex technologies. And so what is required at all levels of the income scale is an enhancement of educational capabilities. And my own judgment is that what's going to happen in the years ahead is that the universities, the public schools will interface with a process which inevitably is going to mean that education, rather than being related to a very early stage of our lives, is of necessity going to extend as far out as our life works occur, because to do otherwise would inevitably relegate a significant part of our population to jobs in which their skills increasingly become less adequate to the task.
Sorry, Mike, we haven't got time. Governor Graves has got the last question. I'm sorry, Mike, I would like to have you, but we have Leon Panetta here. And we're on a very tight schedule, as you know, this afternoon. Governor Graves, I'm sorry, Mike.
Mr. Chairman, we've had a couple of speakers already share with us the pros and cons of the flat tax. Would you care to enlighten us on what the proper rate of taxation should be?
Probably not.
We got to get done this afternoon, too.
Let me just say, Governor, as I very hopefully seamlessly evade that question, to indicate what I think is terribly important. The crucial issue in taxation is that if you have to finance a very high level of expenditure, virtually no tax system will be structured in a manner which will not be undercutting economic efficiencies. So all I would say, without coming to grips with flat taxes, marginal rates, and a variety of other things which I agree with the chairman would go on well into the afternoon, is whenever we think of tax reform, I think we ought to start on the expenditure side. Because if we can keep expenditures down, it is very easy to structure any numerous different tax regimes which are effective from issues of equity and efficiency. If we end up with bloated expenditures, with too high a level of expenditure vis-a-vis our tax base, I don't envisage any particular regime being of necessity so superior that it will eliminate that particular problem. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to meet you.
The final question, Alan, is if the Congress and the President agree upon a balanced budget in 7 years, what will the interest rates go down in 2002? One answer.
Didn't you say I just answered the last question?
Thank you very much, Mr. Greenspan. You were outstanding. I personally am delighted, and I know all the governors are, that you came down and shared your wonderful thoughts with us, and we really appreciate it. I've already asked for it, Mr. Levitt, and I knew you would be asking, so I knew you'd want one, sir. Alan, can you leave a copy, as I asked? Okay. This morning, or this afternoon, we're very pleased once again to have another one of our friends come down and be with us. He's an outstanding public servant and is totally dedicated to the public good with no thought of personal gain. He's a friend of mine, and he's a friend of all of the governors, and he's one of those guys you can call up and you know that you will always get a friendly response. It may not be what you always agree upon, but he will always respond, and he will do it in a friendly manner, something I respect in an individual. I'm delighted, of course, to have Leon Panetta here, but I also found out that he's a graduate of the same school as our Vice Chairman Bob Miller, so I thought it was only fitting to have Bob Miller personally introduce him. Bob has been wanting to do this, and I don't know what's going to happen, so we'll find out shortly. Bob?
I don't think there's much I could add other than that he obviously received an outstanding education, which has resulted in his prominence. I, on the other hand, was obviously at the other end of the curve when we graduated from Santa Clara University at different times. But Leon Panetta and his experience both on the Hill and in the White House have been very positive for this country and certainly for our association. And it is a pleasure to welcome you here today. It is truly a pleasure to work with you on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Bob Miller, as he mentioned, we're graduates of Santa Clara University, which is a good Jesuit school. And I often remember a priest who, in those days, all of us had to take what was called theology classes. And I remember having an old Jesuit who was teaching about the old approach and said essentially that he believed that at the Last Judgment we would all gather in a large valley for a Last Judgment. Everybody would be reunited with their body and they would gather in this large valley. And he went on and on. Finally, I raised my hand. I said, Father, I just don't think that everybody who ever lived can be reunited with their body and all gather in one valley any place on earth. And there was this long silence, and he said, son, if it's good enough for me, it's good enough for you. I use that in the White House staff. But it basically the message was don't make waves. But essentially what governors have to do these days, what the president's trying to do, is to essentially make waves so that we can all work together to try to improve this country and improve the future of our children. I want to personally express my appreciation to all the governors for the cooperation that you've provided, whether it's under a Democratic chairman or under a Republican chairman. I have to tell you that, at least in my experience in this town, which now extends over 20 years, I have never witnessed, either on Capitol Hill or I think for that matter in the administration, the level of cooperation and discussions that we have had with the governors over the last 3 years. It has been intense, it has been continuing, and we deeply appreciate the cooperation that you have provided as we try to work through some very tough issues. I'm a believer that in our form of government, we're talking about the need for a partnership between the federal government and between the states and local government, working together to try to help working families in this country, working together to try to provide a sense of community as we deal with the issues that face these families, working together to promote, I think, a common set of values. What I wanted to do today was to basically summarize where I believe the discussions are with regards to the budget, touch a little bit about where the appropriation situation is, and then I'll be happy to answer your questions. Budgets, as all of you know, are not just about numbers. There's always a tendency in this business when you're dealing with budgets, particularly 7-year budgets, basically to kind of focus on numbers and say, you know, why can't you just split numbers? Why can't you just do it this way? But numbers in a budget are more than just numbers. They're about people, and they're about priorities, and they're about what this country represents in terms of helping people. So budgets go beyond just numbers. This is not just a question of obviously allowing deficits and debts to drive our future, but neither should budgets be about forgetting our obligation to one another. The goal that we have always had, and that the President has, is we have gone into these negotiations, and to any budget for that matter. The fundamental goal is that we have to discipline our budget, we have to significantly reduce our deficits, but we also have to protect our responsibilities, be it on Medicare or Medicaid, be it on the key investments on education and training, on science and technology, on the environment. That we also have to be careful, certainly not to raise taxes on working families. That was the thrust of what we thought we put together in a $500 billion deficit reduction package. And in fact, when we put that in place, as tough as that was, whether you agree or disagree, the reality is that the economy has performed better. We have moved forward. We've been able to make our investments in the key areas we care about, in growth and inflation, have been on the right track, productivity's on the right track, and as the President points out, we're producing almost 8 million jobs in our economy. So there is not a conflict here about whether or not you can balance the budget or discipline your budget, and at the same time provide the investments that keep our economy moving forward. We think you can do both. So our goal has essentially been, let's focus on balancing the budget. We can do it in 7 years. We can do it according to the Congressional Budget Office. But we can also do it in a way that protects those areas that we care about, that affect people. That essentially was built into a bipartisan agreement. in a continuing resolution between the Republicans and the Democrats. In that continuing resolution, we said we're committed to a 7-year budget. We're committed to having it scored by the Congressional Budget Office. But we are also committed to providing adequate resources to Medicare and to Medicaid, to education, to the environment, to veterans. There were a series of investments that we also committed ourselves on a bipartisan basis to as part of these negotiations. And the negotiations themselves have basically been about how do we achieve a balanced budget, but at the same time try to protect these areas. The 50 hours of negotiations in the Oval Office, as all of you can understand, are unprecedented. I have worked, I think, in the time I have been in this town, I have on every major budget summit that has involved the Congress and the President of the United States. And in that time, I have never seen a president commit as much time to direct negotiations with the leadership of the Congress as this president. In 1990, when we were working on the budget agreement at that time with President Bush appeared for about 20 minutes to kick off the negotiations. I think we saw him a few minutes during the negotiations, but never was it at any time the kind of time commitment that this president has committed to trying to reach an agreement. 50 hours of negotiations. There's been a great deal of discussion. As you can understand, there's been a lot of give and take. I think both the president and the leadership understand the positions of both much better than they did. They found that there are, in fact, areas of agreement. They found, obviously, that there are also significant areas of disagreement. But it's been a good give and take. I want to point out that for those that sometimes say there hasn't been much give here, what you have seen in the numbers that we currently have on the table are a movement of almost about $283 billion from the President's original balanced budget proposal in June. We've essentially moved about $283 billion, a big chunk of that in discretionary spending, but a chunk of that in entitlements as well. In addition, the Republicans have moved about $189 billion from their conference report on reconciliation. So as you can see, both sides have in fact moved off of the numbers that had been originally proposed by both sides. Let me summarize the last offer that we put on the table so you can understand where the situation is right now. They've passed out, I think, the charts to all of you. I'm going to just run down each of those areas. We've got the chart here. You can't probably see it, but just follow it off of your documents. The basic areas are the following. And this was the last offer that we put on the table. And incidentally, it is the basis on which we are submitting the 97 budget today. We will basically submit a budget off of these numbers. On Medicare, it is $124 billion in savings. Our original number was about $97 billion. Just to make clear, the proposal on Medicare does not involve any increases with regards to beneficiaries. The area of differences that we have are that there are some differences with regards to Medigap protection. There are differences to what are called medical savings accounts that the Republicans would like to put in place immediately. And there are some differences with regards to how these approaches would be implemented. The President agrees that there has to be choice provided, that we have to provide greater flexibility in terms of plans, but he wants to ensure that the fundamental protection of the Medicare program is in fact in place. We did make some progress here in terms of discussing options. There was a discussion about whether we could take some of the ideas presented by the Republicans and put them into demonstrations, but there nevertheless remained a difference here in the level of savings and whether or not beneficiaries would contribute to the level of savings. Principal concern we have on Medicare as it was proposed in the Congress is that it provides incentives for the healthiest and the wealthiest to get off of Medicare into a private program, but then leaves the program short on resources so that we feel it doesn't sustain the basic program for most of the elderly in the country. That's a fundamental policy difference. I think Republicans would argue that perhaps this could produce greater incentives with regards to choice, but we nevertheless, and the President made clear, that that's our fundamental concern. We do not want to undercut the basic security of the Medicare program itself. The differences there came down to about $124 to $168 billion. On Medicaid, we are at $59 billion in savings. We went from 38 was our original proposal in savings. The fundamental difference there, as all of you know in your negotiations, is the guarantee and whether or not we will protect the fundamental guarantee of health care under Medicaid. The $59 billion is basically our people saying to us that if you want to maintain the level of present care that goes to individuals under the Medicaid program, that's the number you need. And I understand there are differences. We're now looking at about a difference of $85 billion to $59 billion, but our number was based on our people telling us that if you want to maintain the guarantee and the basic benefit programs that you currently require, that's the number you need over the 7-year period. On discretionary, the number is $297 billion over 7 years. It was originally $138 billion, so you can see that the largest movement has been on discretionary in the discretionary area. This represents more than a hard freeze, but it also represents what we believe will protect our investments in education and environment and in high tech. This could represent, however, a reduction in other areas of the budget of anywhere from 10 to 20%. Because obviously if you're going to try to focus your discretionary accounts and your discretionary targeting in education and the environment and high tech, it's going to result in reductions in other parts of the discretionary budget. We did discuss, however, and I think the Republicans concur in this, that if we get a deal, for 96 we will add about $5 billion in discretionary, additional discretionary funds, and for 97 we will add about $10 billion in additional discretionary funds above the levels that the Republicans have proposed. That will, we believe, protect the investments that we care about, and we believe the Republicans would concur in that. On welfare, we have $41 billion. It's an increase from $38 billion, and you realize that our welfare approach here is becoming very similar to the kind of work that the governors are involved with. On EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, this was an area where we believe we can get about $5 billion as a result of actions to enforce against fraud and abuse in the EITC program. This began as a cut in the Republican program of almost somewhere between $25 to $30 billion. And what we have done is said that that's too much. That increases taxes on working families. And we think we now are moving to an area of potential agreement on EITC somewhere between $5 to $10 billion in savings. On other mandatories basically means other entitlement areas. We have largely agreed on about $67 billion worth of savings in these areas. This includes user fees, asset sales, savings from continuing some veteran savings, some retiree savings. We're hoping to get some savings out of the agricultural area, although there's some dispute between the administration and the Congress as to what kind of agriculture program is to be agreed to for savings. So this represents what I would call the other entitlements outside of health care. We have an agreement of about $67 billion in those areas. So when you add those up, plus some additional corporate subsidies, this BLS adjustment, by the way, there's been discussion about whether or not we should do anything with regards to the CPI, the cost of living index. And there are some that would recommend that we in fact go further here. This agreement of $19 billion on the CPI represents where we think the Bureau of Labor Statistics intends to go in terms of reflecting the level of increase in the economy that we anticipate seeing over these next few years. So it is in line with what the Bureau of Labor Statistics would show, and it does not go beyond that, but we still pick up about $19 billion just on that move. Corporate subsidies, we had to have $46 billion. I think the Republicans are at $26 billion. We have a little on tax compliance. When you add that up with interest, it's $740 billion in savings that we have put on the table as our last offer. We recommended a tax cut of about $130 billion. We have moved from a tax cut that we had recommended of 116. It basically would provide for a child tax credit at $500. It would have to transition in, though, because of the number we're using. Education, it provides for the education deductions that the President has recommended. It provides for a backloaded IRA. It provides for small business expensing. There is a small reform on estate and gift tax that's included. There is pension simplification, and there are tax incentives to industries on the so-called brownfields, the abandoned industrial sites, so that they can be cleaned up. So that represents then our basic approach that is on the table and that is included in our budget. Let me just, to show what the President has been talking about in terms of common savings. There are obviously still some differences here, but there are also some areas of common savings that, if in the end we cannot agree as to every area, we ought to at least accept these common savings. On your sheet, you can see the differences there. If you take the Democrats' last offer, or the President's last offer, if you take the Republicans' latest offer, and if you take the minimum of savings laid down by each side, you have a total of $711 billion. So if you just take, in Medicare, instead of 168, take 124, in Medicaid, 59, in corporate subsidies, take the 26 that the Republicans have offered. Just go down and take the minimum savings. You come out with $711 billion. What the President has said is, in the very least, if we can't agree on all of these policy differences, let's accept at least the minimum level of savings that's on the table, because that will get you a balanced budget, and it will be scored by CBO, and it can provide for a minimum tax cut at the same time. So let us not lose at least the opportunity to get a balanced budget if, in fact, that's our goal. Hopefully we can resolve our differences. We think we're close. We would like to continue these negotiations in the Oval Office. They are on hold right now, I think largely because I don't think the leadership is quite certain right now whether in arriving at an agreement they can deliver the votes to basically pass a balanced budget. We hope we can continue to negotiate. We hope we can continue to do that within the Oval Office. But there are some encouraging signs within the Congress itself. There are bipartisan groups. On the Senate side, Senators Breaux and Senators Chafee have put together a bipartisan group that is working, hopefully, towards trying to get a plan that is very close to the level of savings here. There is a coalition group on the House side that is doing very much the same thing. Obviously, if we can build a group from the center out that can agree on a balanced budget and be able to get that through the Congress, then we would certainly want to work with them and get that done. The President deeply feels that we have come a long way, and as you can see from these numbers, we have come a long way. We're close to getting agreement, and we ought to try to get it done before the end, certainly, of this session, and hopefully within these next few weeks. Let me just talk very briefly about the state of appropriations and what we're looking at there. On appropriations, it is unprecedented that we would be in a year. This is fiscal year 96. We still do not have some of the key appropriations bills agreed to by the Congress for fiscal year 96, and we are 4 months into 96. The main bills that are still out are the following: labor HHS, VA HUD and independent agencies, state commerce and justice, interior are the key bills that are still out and that have not been resolved. We have a continuing resolution in place that funds programs through March 15th in these areas, but as you know, it's about a 75% floor. The problem with that is that it is now creating severe problems in terms of planning. School districts are now telling us that they will have to dismiss school teachers, that they are going to have to make significant reductions in terms of what they can provide children in education if they do not get some kind of firm appropriations bill soon. Same thing is true in job training, as was pointed out this morning by one of the governors. In addition to that, we have problems, serious problems in the environment. where we are now seeing inspections in EPA down about 40% and the revolving fund down about 30%. So for that reason, our goal is obviously to try to get a deal. If we get a deal, we can resolve the appropriations bills. If we do not get a deal, I have to tell you that the administration cannot tolerate a short-term CR. We cannot continue to tolerate that for the sake of school districts and for the sake of those that depend on funding in these areas. So our goal will be essentially, hopefully, to resolve these remaining appropriations bills, but in the very least get a level of CR that takes us through October 1 so that people can plan then for the future and not be on a 15 or 30-day hold every time we pass a short-term CR. The same thing, I think, has to be said for the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling has now been extended through March 15th. We thank the Congress for having done that, but frankly, our goal is to not have continuing short-term extensions of the debt ceiling. That's bad business. It's bad for the full faith and credit of this country. We would want a one-year extension of the debt ceiling so that we can make clear to the country and to the world that we do not intend to default, that we will abide by our full faith and credit, and that we will keep our word. That needs to be done, and it needs to be done by the Congress soon. In conclusion, this has obviously been a tough year for everyone. There have been some fundamental differences in direction that we have had to fight through. We have had, obviously, the battle over one group staking out some area on ideology and another group fighting to try to govern at the same time. There is always a time to stake out ideology, but there's also a time to govern, and I think the time to govern is now long overdue. That means that there has to be, frankly, some give. There's got to be some compromise in order to be able to do that. Our responsibilities are to essentially govern this country. There's still time to get a balanced budget. There is still time to resolve the 96 and 97 appropriations. There's time to get a line item veto. There's time to pass the Kennedy-Kassenbaum health care proposal. I think the governors have basically set an example of bipartisan cooperation. And if you can do it, the Congress can do it. The work that you're doing now with regards to the proposals on Medicaid, the work that you're doing on welfare reform is drawing together a bipartisan group to try to work your way through some very tough issues. I think what you presented the President this morning indicates that you're making significant progress in trying to arrive at an agreement here. The President continues to encourage you to move in that direction. We will provide whatever help and guidance we can to try to ensure that ultimately we can get an agreement not only on those areas but on the balanced budget. There's no reason why we cannot have the President and the Congress follow your example of bipartisanship and resolve these issues. We owe it to your states, we owe it to the American people, but most importantly, we owe it to our children. Thank you very much.
Leon has agreed very generously to take a couple minutes to answer any questions that we might have. Any questions? The only question I would have, Leon, is reduction path. There seems to be an acceleration in the outer years. Is there any reason for that it couldn't be more?
Yeah, let me have that.
Sure.
As you can see from the charts, both the President's proposal as well as the Republican proposal chart a very similar path with regards to deficit reduction. There is concern, and I would indicate that it's shared on both sides, about whether or not, instead of moving to 2000 and then having this kind of drop, that there be a greater transition in terms of getting to 2002. Some of this is not easy to do, obviously, as you try to reach a set goal of balancing the budget. And I think, frankly, both sides have to do a little better work at trying to see if we can get a better transition. Part of the problem is the tax proposals. And I would tell you that if there's a major difference that we currently have in the negotiation, it is still over the level of the tax cut. We had proposed $130 billion. The Republicans were still trying to push for a tax cut of somewhere over $200 billion. To do that, obviously, you've got to pay for it. And how do you pay for it? You've got to go back at these programs in order to pay for that level of tax cut. I was encouraged that there are some members now that are talking about the possibility of moving the savings approach and then dealing with the tax cut approach and having that basically be debated on a separate track. There is something to be said for that, because then we can propose a more modest tax cut, show how we would pay for it. Those who want a larger tax cut could show how they would pay for it, and we could debate that out and at least get the savings involved in a balanced budget in place. So there is some hope that perhaps that alternative might be looked at.
Mike Lowry has last question.
Yeah, thank you. Most of us, probably all of us, are dealing with legislatures at home trying to plan a budget, in particularly planning a budget for the future, seeing that the program cuts really come in the out years. One of my calculations were 33 times more in the 7th year than the 1st year under one of the proposals. We have legislators at home that are saying the Congress is not going to come to agreement. There's not going to be a balanced budget, and so we shouldn't be preparing for that now. Is there going to be something along the line of a 7-year balanced budget?
Mike, after 50 hours of negotiation and a lot more discussion both on the Hill as well as at the White House, it's still hard to tell whether in fact that will happen. I think the President's feeling is we have come so far from both sides that with a little more work we can get to an agreement with regards to balancing the budget. I think it would be a mistake to, I think the Speaker had recommended the possibility of basically trying to break up the savings and doing smaller packages. I would be concerned about that approach because, as you know, having been a member, it's easier to cast one vote on some very tough decisions than have to cast 20 votes on 20 tough decisions. And that it would be far better for us to pull a large agreement together than to try to develop 20 smaller agreements in terms of savings. So I would say this, that I think there are many members that are still anxious to see if we can get a balanced budget. The President's anxious to get this done. I still have hope that we can do it if there's a goodwill and commitment on both sides. And I just would not give up on that. It's not to say it's going to be easy, but on the other hand, we have come too far not to give this final agreement to the American people. As I said, we've got $711 billion in common savings here that we ought to embrace. And in the very least, let's embrace those savings. It'll give us a balanced budget. CBO will score it. If there are some fundamental policy differences that remain, we can fight those out to the election. But let's at least agree to this level of savings. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Leon. Appreciate it very much. Thank you, Leon, and thanks. Would you thank the President for this morning? We appreciate it. Right now we have a young star in Congress who has graciously agreed to come back from his home state to be with us this afternoon, and I would like to call upon Governor George Voinovich of Ohio to introduce our next very special guest. George.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're honored to have with us today perhaps this country's most enthusiastic and effective leader in pursuit of our effort to achieve a balanced federal budget. Since assuming the chairmanship of the House Budget Committee, he has led the fight to produce a fair, workable plan to balance the federal budget in 7 years, and he's given every ounce of energy to it. There was no one who could have brought more practical knowledge, experience, and dedication to the budget debate than John Kasich. John has had a passion for balancing the federal budget since he came to Congress in 1983. As a junior member of the Budget Committee, John wrote his own altered budget plans in an annual exercise that routinely challenged conventional wisdom and a lot of cherished cows. In all candor, from time to time, his efforts were cause for a fair amount of discomfort in both political parties. John was talking budget cuts and specific budget cuts long before it was thought to be politically safe to do so. But slowly and surely, John's dogged persistence and willingness to forge working partnerships with colleagues in both parties and all across ideological spectrums began to win, and the respect and admiration he deserved was forthcoming from Washington and others, all of which put him in an ideal position 1 year later to hit the ground, becoming the Budget Committee chairman. John, I think everyone here, each of the governors who make tough calls in balancing our own budgets, appreciates your groundbreaking work to pass the first balanced budget in 3 decades. Every one of us recognizes that we cannot continue to saddle future generations with crippling debt. We also know that our country's future is in mortal danger if we fail. We applaud your efforts, and we want you to know that we are willing to do everything in our part to help you, including what we're doing here at this meeting today. Hopefully, because of the effort of Republicans and Democrats working together, we can break the impasse that you now have with Medicare and Medicaid. Ohio is proud of your leadership, and ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming my good friend and my Congressman, John Kasich.
Thank you, Governor. It's a pleasure for me to be introduced by a great governor like George Voinovich from my state, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with so many of my friends. I didn't have a chance to hear Mr. Panetta. I figured it'd break my rhythm if I was in here. I get trouble getting down here. But listen, I want to first of all, thank you for letting me have the opportunity to come before you. But I want you all to know that what we are arguing about and what we're fighting about and what budgets are all about is not numbers. I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but the fight is frankly not about numbers. It's not about CBO. It's not about OMB. It's not about BLS, CPI, GDP, or any of these other terms. You might as well speak Chinese if you're going to speak in that language. Oh, it's partially about numbers when you get down to simple arithmetic. When you figure out how many people are going to be retired when the baby boomers start retiring and how many people are going to be there to be workers in order to support the retirees. That becomes, of course, a case of numbers. But beyond the simple arithmetic, the fight over the budget is not about 7 years, and it's not about CBO, and it's not just about numbers. A budget is never about that, or I wouldn't have much interest in it. The budget is a fight about values. The budget is a fight about philosophy. The budget is a fight about vision and hopes. And at the federal level, just like at the state level, where you try to propose what would be best for the people that live inside the state of Ohio, the budget of the United States is an effort by the Congress to figure out how to make America better, how to make America more prosperous. That is what the fight about the budget is all about. And let me suggest to all the governors here, and frankly everybody who would watch this show, that the fight is really about the swinging of a pendulum. It's really about common sense, isn't it? You see, because what's happened over the period of the last 41 years is that we as Americans have allowed the pendulum to swing up towards a big central government. And we have done it for the right reasons and the most noble of reasons. And those reasons have a foundation of one single thing: to empower the individual, for the individual in America to be able to live their dreams, for the individual in America to be able to fly. That's why for 41 years we have made an effort to send our power and our money and our influence to the central government so they could do a number of things to empower individuals, including education. You think about what has happened over the course of the last 40 years in education. where we had giant gulfs from one state to another, where some folks in some places just didn't think education was that important, and frankly, they were denying young people, the children of our great country, an opportunity to live their dreams because they weren't giving them the skills. And the federal government assumed a larger part of the burden in an effort to give kids opportunity in America. Medicare. What a wonderful, compassionate program that Medicare is. It allowed our senior citizens to get quality health care and was aimed at rescuing them in the end of their lives from poverty. As noble an idea as man could conceive. And so we sent some of our power and our money to the central government to create Medicare. Medicaid, in a Judeo-Christian society, you are judged on the basis of how you take care of the least of those in your society. And Medicaid was a program that was designed to serve the poor, the disabled, and the poor children of America, and to give them opportunity and to empower them. And the efforts that we've made over the last 25 years to help the disabled be able to have equal rights in America is wonderful. And we felt the central government needed to provide the leadership. Maybe the gemstone, the cornerstone of all the power and money and influence we sent to the central government can be viewed in the context of the civil rights movement, where Americans, because of their color, had a ride in the back of the bus as a best case, and in most cases, in many corners of this country, were treated like animals. And we said, with great compassion and great hope, that we wanted to use the central government to beat down the barriers of racism and discrimination. And we've gone a long way. But you know, like any other pendulum, at some point it's time for the pendulum to swing back. And frankly, what we're fighting about today, the Republicans on Capitol Hill and the administration, is about philosophy, common sense, and that pendulum. And what we're arguing is those reasons why we sent money and power and influence to the central government to empower individuals is precisely why we need to bring the pendulum back. Because frankly, ladies and gentlemen, in your states, you know that Americans over about the last decade have felt as though they've sent too much power and too much money and too much influence to the central government, and they believe in their hearts that it's time to end the frustration that they feel and the sense of hopelessness throughout our communities, that they can't stand up to the government and the government isn't serving them, that if in fact we can give the power and the money and the influence back to our citizens in all the towns and all the villages of this country, they can do better themselves to solve problems where they live, that they can show compassion better. Whether it's in New Jersey or Kentucky or Indiana, people living in neighborhoods believe that they can show better compassion than the federal government. They believe that they can educate their children better, don't they, George Allen? They believe that in the state of Virginia, they don't need a federal bureaucrat or the federal government to try to tell them how their children are going to get educated. In fact, they're not even real enamored with the idea of George Allen telling them. They want to do it right in their communities because they believe that they can educate their children better where they live. They believe they can choose health care better. And they believe they can create jobs for their fellow men and women. But I want to tell you that they also feel as though big government and powerful bureaucrats who regulate every part of their lives and each and every part of their business are beginning to crush their ability to effect change themselves in the areas where they live. There is a fear that Washington, the central government in Washington, D.C., is out of control, that it's threatening their children's future by driving us towards bankruptcy, and that America's greatest legacy is starting to become at risk. And that legacy is this, that your children will have a better tomorrow, that your children will inherit an opportunity in this country that is better than what you inherited from your children. And they're beginning to believe that won't happen. Look at the polls. Look at the frustration. Look at the hopelessness on the faces of mothers and fathers across this country who are worried, deathly worried about their children's future. And you know, they know, as we know, that the 21st century is not about big taxes and big governments and powerful bureaucrats. It's about the power of the individual. You think about this. In the 21st century, the next millennium, and Martin Luther King talked about the next century in 1963. We're right on the edge of the next century, the next millennium. A 12-year-old child with a magical instrument called a computer will be more powerful in many respects than his mother and his father. The 21st century is not the era of bigness and bureaucracy and overtaxation and overregulation. And what we are arguing is out of the same compassion where we sent power and money and influence to the central government to empower the individual, we want our power and our money and our influence brought back to our local communities so one more time the individual in America can be empowered. That's what it's all about. And we feel that standing in our way are Washington lawyers, Washington lobbyists, and Washington special interest groups. And you know, I suppose if you had a beachfront condo in Ocean City, you worked 3 days a week, you ate in the fanciest restaurants in the world, and you played golf at some of the great places, and you had a group of rebels that came down there and said you wanted to transfer power, money, and influence out of this city, which makes you less important, you wouldn't like it either, would you? You would fight against giving me my power and my money and my influence back, and that's what this is all about. But I want to get specific with you. I want to talk to you about trust. I want to talk to you about trusting people. You see, that's what this is about. Who do you trust? Washington bureaucrats or people that live across this great country of ours? I want to tell you about Medicare. I don't know how many of you saw the New York Times front page story today, but Medicare is in worse shape than what the Republicans thought it was. Yeah, the bureaucrats in Washington were wrong again. Medicare heads towards bankruptcy, not in 7 years, but in a shorter period of time than that. And you know what we've done? We've tried to touch the third rail of American politics, the entitlement programs, and we have said in Medicare that the single most important thing we could do is to keep it solvent. That we must guarantee our senior citizens that they will have a program, a viable, quality program to take care of their health needs for as long as they shall live and for the next generation. And you cannot save Medicare by transferring pieces of it out of the Medicare Trust Fund into the general fund and heaping even more burden on young, working families in America. We cannot play shell games with a precious program called Medicare, but we believe the way in which you fix it is to give people choice, to allow them to choose the kind of system they want to be in, exactly the kind of system that exists in your states, for your employees, and across small businesses and large businesses all over this country, where we've been able to control the costs of our health care programs for the first time in a generation, while at the same time being able to guarantee quality. And we want to break the iron fist of the big federal bureaucracy called the Health Care Financing Agency that couldn't even get this right. We want to break the fist, the iron fist, of Washington bureaucrats so that our senior citizens can choose that health care plan that will give them quality and will result in their program being sustained and controllable. But I want to talk to you about young workers. You know the group of people in America who are the most forgotten? They're young, working Americans with children. And they're paying more and more of the bill, and no one is ever thinking about them. And if we cannot, see, it is not inconsistent to have a quality Medicare program while at the same time being able to have some control of the cost of that program so we don't bankrupt the young people in this country. But you got to be able to have choice. You got to be able to stop the politics. And I hope that today the President has read this article and understands that Medicare needs to be taken out of the political debate and put on the table for real solutions, trusting in Americans to make good choices. Now, I want to talk to you about welfare and Medicaid. But you know what I want you to do? I want you to look around this table, because you know, Medicare to some degree is trusting people. Medicaid and welfare is the Congress of the United States trusting you as messengers for your people in each of your 50 states. And the thing that I can't understand is how anybody who is a governor in our 50 states would allow somebody in Washington to say that you're not capable, that you don't care, that you're not to be trusted. And I want you to think, when all 50 governors get back in here, I want you to look around the table, and I want you to figure out which guy and which woman don't you trust. Do you not trust Christy Whitman? Do you not trust George Bush? Do you not trust Governor Sundquist or Evan Bayh? Well, maybe you don't, but I do. You see, I do trust that you will be good stewards and good messengers for your people. And that's what welfare is all about. Let me just show you very quickly the welfare situation in this country. And I think you all know it very well. You can see that welfare spending in this country is going through the roof. ADC enrollment is going through the roof. Illegitimacy rate. The President just formed a commission to try to figure out how to stop illegitimacy, through the roof. Violent crime, which really threatens the rights of every American, through the roof, with a little late leveling off this year. Let's hope it's going to last. And the poverty rate. We're not winning the war on poverty, are we? Now, I would not mean for 1 second to tell you that the high rates of welfare have caused any of this. That's not what I'm telling you. But what I am telling you is that a Washington-run program, run by Washington bureaucrats who don't even know what time zone you're in, Governor Bayh. You ever call them down here? Before you get off the phone, they'll say, "Now, what time is it in Indiana?" What time? Governor Voinovich will say, "What time is it in Ohio? Is it the same time in Indiana that it is in Ohio?" They don't even know what time zone we live in. Governor Schaefer, they'd never get you right. What we're saying is that this Washington one-size-fits-all philosophy hasn't served us, has it? And so what we're trying to do with welfare is to trust you to run the program, to trust you to end the one-size-fits-all mentality. And you know, when you take a look at what you have to do, you come to Washington on hands and knees to beg a bureaucrat whose biggest challenge during the day is to fight their way across the 14th Street Bridge every morning to allow you to serve your people with compassion. Governor Engler in Michigan, he has a program from his savings and welfare that he got from his waiver that allows him to provide a health card to people coming off welfare. Governor Weld in the state of Massachusetts, boy, he's on the leading edge of saying we got to take care of people who have mental illness. That's something nobody has wanted to touch, to fix, to address. Bill Weld did it out of the savings of his welfare plan. And Tom Carper wanted to do it a little bit differently, and they're telling him no, no, 1,000 times no. That's not how we're going to fix welfare. I want to tell you that this weekend I was in New Hampshire, big meeting, 300 people. And I said to him, we want to send welfare back to the states. Frankly, we don't even want to send it to the states. We want to get it in the local community so that if Mr. Smith doesn't want to go to work, we pick him up and put him in the back of our pickup truck and we take him to work, don't we, Governor Bush? And if Mrs. Jones is sick with 2 children, we take care of her. That's compassion. He wants faith-based welfare. He shouldn't have to come here and get on his hands and knees and beg a Democrat or a Republican, for that matter, doesn't matter which party, bureaucrat, to tell him how he's going to take care of his people. Well, we had a vote in New Hampshire. I said, look, ladies and gentlemen in the room, 300 people, I said, I'm going to let you give 10% of your income to help poor people. I want to know how many in here would send it to a government-run welfare agency, and how many of you would give it to a charitable group to deliver health to the poor. I got 1 vote for the government agency, and everybody else was going to send their money to a local-based welfare operation that was charitable. And frankly, what it all gets down is the 3 legs of a stool: community, family. Community is a critical part of all of this. Family is another absolutely vital part of this, and faith. You put the 3 legs of the stool and you begin to deal with welfare. I trust you. I want you to run it. Medicaid. You know, my governor told me that if we don't control Medicaid, Medicaid is becoming a giant entitlement program wrapped around his neck, and what it's beginning to do is to erode into the programs of education, taking care of the environment in the state of Ohio, being able to do a whole host of things, because he's being strangled by a federal program that was designed to treat those people who don't have power and money and influence and who are disabled. And he says he has a better way to do it, but let's talk about Governor Sunquist. Governor Sunquist has a program in Tennessee that is giving the most amount of care to people in this country, health care in this country, than any other state in this country, including Hawaii, which has an employer mandate. He didn't create the program. A Democrat created the program, but he's been a good steward of it, and he's making it better. And what is Medicaid all about? Medicaid is allowing you to end the one-size-fits-all philosophy and to allow you to serve people in your states the way you think is best. And I believe that if we can cut down on the bureaucracy, the red tape, the rulemaking directed out of Washington, you will show more compassion to your fellow man. You will treat more children and more poor and more disabled than you do at the current time. And who stands in your way? Bureaucrats that have your power and your money. And for those that don't trust a whole lot in here, we've got a new program that says we'll only trust you halfway. If we don't trust that you can show real compassion, well, we'll require the states to cover these populations of pregnant women and young children and poor children and the disabled folks and the elderly, and to make sure that they get a benefits guaranteed package. Surely the governors of this country can agree that this is a far better way to run Medicaid than the current system of being blocked and frustrated in your ability to show real compassion. So with both welfare and Medicaid, we want you to be stewards for your people. We want you to be the messenger. We want you to show real compassion to the people we've tried to serve. And all we're asking for is common sense that swings the pendulum back out of Washington into your hands, and better than that, into the hands of the people who elected you. I want to talk about tax relief quickly. The economy's going south. We need to get the economy moving in this country. Now, we got the highest tax on risk-taking that I can think of in any major industrialized nation in the world. You know what capital gains is all about? First of all, if you're an older couple and you lived on a farm and you want to sell your farm, I don't think the government ought to take the whole value of your farm. You ought to get a capital gains break. And if you're a senior citizen, you want to sell your home, you ought to get a capital gains break. And if you're just a guy that delivers mail like my dad did, and you happen to have some kind of an investment in the stock market, you make a gain, you ought to get a capital gains rate. But you know, capital gains to some degree is about rich people taking risks. You see, I like when rich people take risks, because when they take risks, I get a job in the plant that they create. And then I get a job there, and then I go and I take the money and I get an education. And then I get like real smart, and then I go out and I buy them out in a leveraged buyout, and then that rich guy ends up working for me. You see, in a society like ours, in good times the rich get richer. In bad times the rich get richer. The only time the poor get rich are when things are good. That gives them the greatest opportunity to elevate themselves and for them to become rich. Frankly, what it's about is opportunity. The second piece of the tax cut is the child credit. You know, one brilliant, I think it was a Democratic politician said, the best department of health, education, and welfare is the American family. If there is any institution that must be rebuilt into the 21st century, it is the American family. And as we downsize government, we ought to give them a piece of their money back. The children of this country ought to be held the highest, and they deserve some of their money back. And frankly, they'll spend the money better than anybody in Washington can dream up. And that's why the family tax credit has got to be the part of any solution. To the Democrat governors here, we need you to help us fashion a bipartisan solution, Governor Lowry. We need you. I know that your concern about the Republican plan is not political. But I ask you to search your heart, as I do every day, about when I go to do this job, to make sure it's not political. And I ask you to think about it, because frankly, this is the last chance that you have to really design this program of Medicaid and welfare, to save your own budgets, to allow you to set your own priorities. I mean, I'm just asking you to take a chance to work with our Republican governors to design a program on a bipartisan basis that both sides have to give a little bit, but at the end of the day, we can reach an agreement. Now, I know that's tough sometimes. Sometimes if you have to take a little heat from your own people, like I did from the last administration, wasn't fun to go out and try to kill a B-2 bomber with Dick Cheney as the Secretary of Defense, but that's life. You know, John Kennedy said that sometimes we do things not because they're easy, but we do them because they're hard. This isn't a political appeal. I sat with Governor Romer and Congressman Condit, leader of the Blue Dogs, and asked them to get together with the Republican governors of Engler and Leavitt here just a couple months ago. And I said, you can give us the breakthrough that we need. Look, to all of us, we're on the edge of the 21st century. If we don't get a change, we're going to drown in debt. And the one number I'll tell you is for a child born today, with the status quo in effect, that child throughout his lifetime will give 84 cents out of every dollar he or she earns to the government. They won't work for 84 cents out of every dollar to be paid to somebody that they don't know and they don't see and frankly they think is wasting their money. This is our chance. We are stewards at the end of the 20th century. We have an obligation to do some of the heavy lifting so that the children of the next millennium are going to be able to have their hopes and their dreams. That's what this is all about. We do it for the children. And if we can reach agreement on saving the Medicare system, which rolls towards bankruptcy, and we can give people choice, and if we can trust you, and you can trust one another, and you can trust your people to be smarter than people here, then we can reach agreement. You see, it's not about numbers, it's about policies, it's about philosophy. Who do you trust? And if we blow this opportunity and we continue at 100 miles an hour towards bankruptcy, the 21st century will mean being choked by red tape and bureaucracy driven out of this central government. It will mean bankruptcy for our young people. It will mean a slash in benefit for our baby boomers and tax rates that are just unconscionable. But on the flip side, Ronald Reagan talked about the shining city on a hill. You know, it's a shining city on a hill that's shining because we're generous. As Americans, we're loving, we're peaceful, we're kind, we seek justice, we're righteous without being self-righteous. And the greatest thing about America is why people came here the whole time we've existed. It's because people see this as the land of opportunity and a chance for them to live their dreams. Now look, we've done some wonderful things over the last 40 years by empowering this city. But if we're going to empower people again, if we're going to give them a sense of hope rather than hopelessness, then we need to take the power and the money and the influence and put it back in their hands, reinstitute the Judeo-Christian principles that this country was founded on, and Ronald Reagan's shining city on a hill will not be tarnished. And you know what's important? The rest of the world, it sees the beacon. Its hope is America. Its model is America. And if we can plug together as Republicans and Democrats and trust the people who run this country, we're going to be able to have a beautiful, wonderful, shining city on the hill into the 21st century that our children and our grandchildren can inhabit. Thank you for letting me be here today.
Are there any questions of Congressman Kitchen? Yes, Governor Graves.
Congressman, I want to follow up on a comment that Governor Lowry made to Leon Panetta. Just, you know, my legislature's in session. I know each governor's got a different sort of dynamic back at home they have to deal with, but I've got people back in my home state who want to be part of the shaping the new look to our state that's going to be the result of whatever changes occur here, and they're all actually getting kind of frustrated that you know, they want to wrap up a session, go back and run their own election campaigns and so forth, and I have a great fear that this whole thing is going to drag on and into the late spring or the summer and not get resolved at all. Have you got any good advice for those of us that are trying to figure out where this is going to end up so that we can make plans with, you know, to any certainty?
Well, I mean, George Pataki's already budgeted for an enormous amount of change occurring, and I can't even imagine the fiscal train wreck that he's going to experience if we don't get something worked out here, and many of you are in the same position. So it's not just the fact that many of you have planned for these changes, but at the same time, if you were to, for example, get a capped block grant program, that's an unfunded mandate on you. You can't live with that. I mean, how can we give you fewer dollars and no flexibility? And it is not just a matter of degree. I mean, well, we know what the threshold is. We know what the threshold of success is, and you can all work it out. That's why I would urge you to have everybody sit down. But I've got to tell you something. I'm not going to cave in to some half-baked deal that's based on some goofy numbers written by CBO and OMB. This is philosophical. You see, because if all we do is add up numbers, you know, I'm going to go on a diet. I'm going to lose 50 pounds this year. The first 51 weeks, I'm going to lose 1 pound, but in that last week, I'm going to lose 49. I mean, I'm not going to sign off myself personally on another rotten Washington deal. This has to be done right. And it's not just numbers, it's philosophical. And all I can tell you is that if we cave in now, we're going to come back in 5 years and it's going to be worse. It's going to be immensely more difficult. Now look, I got a sense that there's starting to be a lot of pressure being put on a lot of people. Memos flying all over the place, polls from one party to the other about, you know, maybe at the end of the day, we can convince the administration that, you know, basically this is about shifting power. That's why I asked a couple of Democrats to do it, because look, a number of you are aware of the midnight mandates from Washington on Medicaid. You wake up the next day, you go, what the heck they do down there? We're giving you a chance to design your program to fit your people. You got to seize the opportunity. You can, and you're going to. I'm going to make a prediction. You're going to. Because there is no way that we can keep moving along with unsustainable rates of Medicaid and unsustainable rates of Medicare and unsustainable rates of welfare. It just can't happen. We're too smart for that. And we're not ready to put the white flag up. Talk to your governors, get down on your hands and knees, pray first, and then beg some of the Democrats to work with you. I know with this chart on Medicaid, get that chart back up there one more time. I mean, I can't figure out who isn't cared for under this chart. I mean, we're going to guarantee all of these benefits. This is not just some pure block grant. This has got everybody lined out who we're ever concerned about being able to help. This is good. This is a compromise. Republicans went from $270 billion in Medicare savings down to $168 in the spirit of compromise. I will tell you this, that by doing that, we've shortened the life expectancy of that program. Now, we think we've moved to shore it up till the edge of the baby boomer generation, but I got to tell you, every dollar less we save and the faster that program grows, it's going to run out of money. So I would say, Governor, you slide over there next to my friend Lowry there and whisper in his ear, and let's get an agreement between all of you on Medicare and Medicaid before you leave here this week.
I'd just like to remind the governors that we have a very busy afternoon, and the more questions you ask, the less opportunity we have to go in there and whisper in Mike Lowry's eye. Here.
And listen, and Tommy, they may ask me one I can't answer. That'd be the scariest.
Governor Lowry, for a very short question.
John, you and I have been friends a long time, and I appreciate your courage and your leadership for a balanced budget. Two items. Last year in the state of Washington took 10,200 people off of welfare into the job rolls, saved $34 million, using waivers and using the things that we could do to do that. A high success story, I think, ranks with any state, if not the best in the country. We did that because we weren't constricted by things like teenage mothers where they can be covered on AFTC, family caps, things we didn't want to do. We were able to do so. So will we have from Congress support a welfare reform that won't have any type of restrictions on states so that we can do our jobs?
Well,
second question, I'll give you two. Second, as you know well, health care inflation is actually higher than Medicaid inflation. And our biggest problems, our biggest problems in the state is the fact that we can't get around the ERISA mandate onto states by the federal government. If we could get rid of the ERISA mandate onto states by the federal government, we can do much more in Medicaid. So will you commit to help us get rid of that federal control of states accomplishing real savings in health care?
Let me suggest to you that Harris Faywell is our expert on ERISA, and I will call him tomorrow and make sure he calls you to get your views on how that program needs to be reformed. Everybody knows that it needs reform, and I hope we will get on that immediately.
Okay.
And I will talk to him. And in regard to the welfare and the waiver, I mean, first of all, I don't want you to have a waiver. I want you to be able to go out and design your own program. And as you know, inside the Congress, we had some debates on some minimums. And I personally would rather have either no minimums or very few minimums, because I trust you to design the program the way you want to. And then we can look at each state's experience and come out with a result. I don't think that Tom Carper should have been denied the reforms, maybe you've now since gotten them through, but I mean, he had some unique ideas in terms of how to control the problem of illegitimacy in this country. There ought to be the minimum, but as you know, Governor, you got to pass the bill, and it'll be tough if we ever get to the point where we think we reach some agreement. I got a sense that I'm going to be right in front, having all kind of things thrown at by my colleagues, but that's part of leadership. I can promise you that Speaker Gingrich wants there to be fundamental changes, and he'll fight, and if we have to make a few compromises in terms of taking some people on who feel strongly about this mandate.
Anybody really need and feel compelled to ask any more questions?
I sure do.
Governor Carper.
I'll make it real quick. John, it's great to see you, my friend. The waiver, we asked for the Clinton administration for two waivers. One of those was to enable us to go to a managed care Medicaid system January 1 of this year. We got that. We're up and running. The second one was to implement our welfare reform plan, A Better Chance, which we implemented last October 1st. The piece that has not yet been approved, it's not been denied, they just have deferred a decision, is a piece that we want to implement in 1999. So it's actually been pretty responsive.
Well, my only concern is if the Governor Voinovich puts a waiver in, I don't know how long. In fact, he's had this waiver in on trying to be able to make reforms in our program in order to serve more of his population, and we should never have to jump through all these hoops, and it's ridiculous. I trust you folks will do it the best, and I want different laboratories going on inside this country because we learn, and one government learn from others. So let's get this worked out, Mr. Carper, if we can, before you get out of here. Thanks, Governor.
Governor Voinovich has an emergency question. In less than 5 words, say what it is,
John, if we can cut a deal here, will you buy it?
Well, I'm convinced that...
Say yes. Say yes.
Yes. Okay. Hey.
A motion to adjourn is in order. Please quickly get to the governor's only meeting. We got a very, very busy agenda.
I'm going to go up with Zelf.